Hi everyone, and welcome to Critcraft. Today's project was prompted by an experience I had recently that changed my perspective on life's mistakes and failures. More on that story later as we move through the project. I began by rifling through my junk boxes. I pulled out a number of promising pieces for what I dreamed would become a structure fit for a world of science fiction. I imagined a building with advanced technology, so I gathered up a variety of shapes that I thought looked cool and space age. I ended up not using several of these, but you never go wrong with too many parts to begin with. The final piece of this project will be my old decommissioned airbrush, which was the leading inspiration for this fun diorama. As you can see, it's a bit worse for wear. Well, that's because of the mistakes I alluded to in the video thumbnail. I'll tell you more about that in just a few minutes. I started construction by creating a solid base for the structure and then slowly building upwards. My process was pretty easygoing. It was mostly just picking out various materials and sticking them wherever my imagination told me to. I selected bits and pieces that to me communicated power and precision, and that roughly imitated my conception of fine German engineering, which was at the foundation of my old airbrush. As the build progressed, so too did my imagination, and I soon found myself dreaming of creative projects past. This new building somehow reminded me of a story that I began writing some 20 years ago. A central theme to that story was the existence of a creative energy condensed into blue particles that were only detectable by the most creative of people. Certain tools and instruments that were developed by cultures throughout the centuries could generate, harness, and dispense this blue energy, giving special powers to those that use them in their creative pursuits. With this concept in mind, I started to see my little building as a piece of technology that would play a role in the propagation of creative energies. My airbrush, which will be the cap piece of this creative structure, is one of those special tools that can inspire artists. It definitely inspired me as I learned to paint, and it continues to inspire me now, though by other means. I'll share more about that when the station construction is finished. I wasn't sure how my finished building would look, or if all the random parts would read as cohesive and convincing in the end. But I kept on crafting at my own pace, not so much concerned about deadlines, but about having fun and allowing my imagination to guide my hands. Here I repurposed some cross-stitching mesh into exhaust vents. I figure stations like these probably generate a good deal of heat, and my little building couldn't be taken seriously if I didn't engineer some form of airflow technology to keep it cool. After filing down the edges of the air vents, I moved back to the central tower to add some detail. I used hole punches to make these rings from a sheet of styrene. I couldn't tell you what purpose they serve, but man, gluing them to that carbon fiber shaft was pretty much magical. I continued adding bits and pieces for texture and visual interest. I wrapped more cross-stitching mesh around the tower and added a few cable ties for good measure. And then the tower needed something more, like a build-out for maintenance, or an apparatus on which to stand and survey and fix things. I started with a curved piece of thin wood to establish a general shape for the build-out, and then added some flooring of the same material. Once the platform was in place, I added these cool pieces of plastic, which for the life of me I cannot remember where they came from, or even picking them up. But I like what they added to the shape of the build-out. In the next step, I pulled out my finger drills for some real crafting tedium. I wanted my building to have wires or conduit draped around it. To support those wires, I made these brackets with a square styrene rod and some resistors. I later clipped the styrene into segments and glued them in a pattern around the base of the building. I really liked their look after the wires were in place. At this point, all that was left for the building was the electronics. With some drilling and filing, I installed a rocker switch in the base of the building. That thick ABS plastic was not cooperative, I'll have you know. I hacked at it for a good 20 minutes to make this hole. I then soldered the leads to the switch and insulated those connections with heat shrink before moving on to lighting. I used a flexible LED filament that I found on AliExpress. This bright little noodle was fiddly and no adhesive on earth can stick to it, so I threaded it into segments of heat shrink to make it more manageable. There was actually about 15 minutes of footage here of the filament flailing about, flipping out of my hands and shooting the bits of heat shrink all over my desk. Apparently I needed a lesson on patience and self-control. These are things that don't come very easily for me, but I think I get a little bit better at it with each craft project. With the LED somewhat tamed now, I whipped it into the shape of a Well, I don't actually know what you call this, but I whipped it and bridled it with cable ties for easy handling. I then fixed it to a popsicle stick with another cable tie and shoved it into the underside of the tower. After it was secure, I lined it up with the switch leads and soldered again, this time fitting the filament between the switch and the battery pack, which I installed a little later. I love watching heat shrink melt, don't you? With the building construction all done and the electronics mostly finished, I pulled out my painting booth and started the second phase of this project. While I paint, I'd like to share with you some of the backstory that I promised earlier. I think it'll be helpful in explaining why my airbrush was the inspiration for this build. Not long after I had finished the crafting portion of my last video, I started working on a new project, sort of an in-between side craft to keep my creative juices flowing. Well, early in the crafting, I committed that cardinal sin of airbrush maintenance by not cleaning it after a painting session. A thick helping of primer was left to dry in the airbrush overnight, leaving a mess that even a seasoned hobbyist would cringe at. After doing some research, I decided it was best to soak it in airbrush cleaner for a few hours, which, according to painting gurus, would shortcut the cleaning process and make things much easier. So I disassembled the airbrush, placed the parts in a cup of cleaner, and left the room feeling rather satisfied with myself for the astute planning that I had done. Well, a few hours turned into about 4 days, as is often the case with my distractibility. When I returned to my airbrush, I found that the cleaner had actually done a great job dissolving the paint. So great, in fact, that once it had finished with the paint, it kept right on doing its job dissolving things, including all of the O-rings and seals inside the airbrush, as well as the black anodized metal that covered the airbrush body. The cleaner had also eaten away the surface of the threads inside the airbrush head, which proved to be the ultimate nail in the coffin of my fancy little airbrush. From then on, I couldn't get a good seal between the air cap and the airbrush head. My prized hobby tool was dead, and I was the fool who murdered it. In a rage, I threw it in the trash and stormed out of the room, muttering to myself things like, "This is why I can't have nice things," and several choruses of, "I'm a failure." Expletives omitted. A few days passed, and I had somewhat recovered from the event. With a cooler head, I looked back on the experience and tried to see it differently. This was a really difficult thing for me to do. Not to get too personal, but my brain is wired to make mountains out of molehills. Even the little hiccups in life are often amplified, making them feel like a really big deal, when in reality, to other people, they're probably not that bad. So when I recalled my airbrush murder, at first, all I could see was failure, and all I could feel was intense anger. At some point, I'm not sure exactly when, a thought came to me that caused a shift in my feelings. I remembered a quote or some anecdote regarding the definition of failure. I don't know how much of this is Google or movies or my own thoughts, but my definition of failure isn't the act of falling on your face, but the act of committing to never try again. This thought gave me an unexpected glimmer of hope, just enough to slightly change my perspective, not only of my airbrush disaster, but also my life. Shortly after this shift, I remembered something that I had probably learned several times over years of therapy. It was the simple concept that I could apply to many of the pains and perceived failures that I encounter in my life. It was the idea that I could choose how I want to feel about my bad experiences. It occurred to me that I could decide whether my airbrush mistake would pull me down into an abyss of self-criticism and hopelessness, or lift me up into forgiveness, hopefulness, and personal growth. In that moment, I chose a more challenging road, to try to see myself as a flawed but improving individual with hope for a better future. I chose to change my perspective and turned a painful memory into a positive reassurance that growth can come from anything, even the costliest of mistakes. When I threw my airbrush in the trash 4 days before, it was with the thought that I never wanted to see it again, because it had the potential to remind me of my failure and reinforce my lifelong obsession with self-destructive thinking. But during this epiphany, which happened in the shower, by the way, I don't know why, but a lot of my breakthroughs seem to occur in the shower, I decided to pull my airbrush from its garbage grave and look at it again with fresh eyes. And as I did, I felt something like forgiveness, and began thinking of ways not to bury my mistake and forget it, but to display it. So I let my creativity run wild as long as I needed to come up with a plan to build an uplifting monument to my mistake. So here we are now with the base nearly finished. All that was left to do was adding some greenery to the ground and then painting the station before final assembly. The scale of this project was pretty small, maybe N scale or something like it, so I went with a 2mm static grass for the ground. Sometimes at the end of a long day, all I need is to lay down some grass and vacuum up that spillage until all is right in the world. When I was happy with the coverage, I grabbed my newer airbrush and added some highlights with a bright yellow. I really liked the effect that it made on the dark green grass. I applied the yellow as lightly as I could, just to brighten the green hue a little bit here and there. With the base now completed, I pulled out my already primed station and got to work painting with my brushes. I used a mix of model and game colors from Vallejo, as well as shade and contrast paints from Citadel. There was also a Createx airbrush color that I used on the styrene trim. Those paints are designed for use in auto and other industrial applications and are more durable after curing, which I thought might be a good idea to use on the sides of the diorama. In case you're curious about them, I'll include in the video description a list of the exact colors that I used in this project. For my color inspiration, I mainly relied on a kind of historically inaccurate depiction of World War II era Germany. There's probably nothing German about it, really. I just threw on colors and weathering that made the station look like an old and well-used building. To give the lower half of the station a flat finish and some streaking, I sprayed isopropyl alcohol on the surface while I painted. This also had a diluting effect on the paint that made it more transparent, like a wash. I really liked the dirty concrete look that it gave to those 3 vertical supports. To finish up the station painting, I dry brushed a metallic color here and there to make it look like the paint had worn off over time. I then grimed up the conduit and observation deck to complete that distressed look before moving on to the final assembly of the diorama. After drilling a hole in the flat area of the diorama and cleaning things up with my trusty vacuum, I moved on to checking the lighting circuit one last time before making things permanent. Looks good, very blue, very bright. I then fished the battery leads through the hole, and that was tricky. They're really soft and don't like to follow instructions. I then used super glue to mount the battery pack, and when the glue was dry, I twisted the wires together and joined them using my soldering iron. Then after insulating the connections with heat shrink, I finished up by securing the wires with the old cable tie through the wall technique, which was first developed by German engineers during the Second World War. Bet you didn't know that. And finally, with newer airbrush in hand, I used the Createx paint I mentioned earlier to finish off the sides of the diorama with a durable black coat. I suppose we could all use a durable black coat now and then, you know, for rainy days, snowy nights, and for dioramas. If you take nothing else from this video, I hope you at least learn one thing. Remember, my friends, if you ever murder your airbrush or any other cherished thing in your life, it's not because you're worthless or a terrible human being. It's because your blood sugar's low. And all of your quirks and personality traits that you constantly scrutinize, they're all endearing to the right people in your life. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. I appreciate you more than you know, and I hope to see you again very soon. Questions, suggestions, and tips, please leave in the comments, because that's how I improve. And don't forget to subscribe if you like watching me make stuff. You guys are the best. Take care.